Some mornings carry the illusion of stillness, where every movement, every sound is muffled under the weight of routine. That was the kind of morning Elijah Monroe stepped into when he arrived at Gate B12 of the International Terminal. He walked quietly beside Marla Jensen, the woman who had cared for him since he was a boy, her hand resting gently on his shoulder as they moved through the soft hum of airport life. Elijah, 16, was tall for his age, with an air of composed silence that made him seem older. He wore a navy hoodie, clean jeans, and a worn pair of gray sneakers, clothes chosen not for fashion, but for comfort and the ability to move unnoticed. His curls were tucked beneath a plain beanie, and a dark leather backpack hung from one shoulder, slightly faded but well kept. In his pocket was a first-class boarding pass. Most passengers walked past him without a glance. A few looked once, then twice, their curiosity fading into disinterest. But when Elijah approached the boarding lane marked Priority and First Class, something in the air changed. Subtle but sharp. Marla scanned their passes at the gate, offering a polite smile to the agent. "Mr. Elijah Monroe, seat 1A, she said softly, "and I'm just accompanying him." The gate agent, a younger woman with tired eyes and a practiced politeness, barely looked up. "Yes, ma'am, go right ahead." But once they stepped onto the jet bridge and entered the cabin of Flight 237, the mood shifted. The first-class section was bathed in soft amber light. Cream leather seats, polished chrome fixtures, and the faint scent of citrus-scented disinfectant created the illusion of calm luxury. A handful of early-boarded passengers were already seated. Businessmen hunched over laptops, a couple sipping champagne, and an elderly woman reading a hardbound novel. And then came the voice. "You two, excuse me." A sharp tone pierced the serenity like glass breaking. Elijah turned, startled. A woman approached from the galley, her uniform perfectly pressed, her name tag gleaming, Kathleen Brooks, senior flight attendant. Her face held no smile, only suspicion. "Sir," she said, addressing Elijah, but not looking him in the eye, "this is the first-class cabin. May I see your ticket again?" Elijah blinked, caught off guard. Marla stepped forward, already sensing something behind the question. "We already scanned in," she said kindly, holding up the boarding pass. "Seat 1A, booked and confirmed. He's—" "I didn't ask you," Kathleen interrupted. Her eyes bore into Elijah with the unspoken challenge. "Young man, do you mind?" With calm hands, Elijah reached into his hoodie pocket and presented the same boarding pass he'd already shown at the gate. Kathleen didn't even take it. She stared at it from a distance, then at him again. Then she leaned in slightly and lowered her voice. "Are you sure you're in the right section?" Marla's brows knit together. "I can assure you, Ms. Brooks, this ticket was purchased through the Monroe account." Kathleen raised a hand, palm outward, silencing her. "Please don't make this more complicated than it needs to be." Elijah, still silent, looked toward his seat. Empty, inviting. He made no move toward it. Kathleen finally took the boarding pass, glanced at it for a second, then scoffed under her breath. "This must be some kind of mistake." The line of passengers boarding behind them slowed. A few began to murmur. "He has every right to be here," Marla said, her voice firm now. But Kathleen ignored her. Instead, she turned back to Elijah and said, louder this time, "You'll need to step aside until we verify this." Her tone had shifted from skeptical to commanding. Several heads turned. One man in a business suit adjusted his tie awkwardly. A woman nearby clutched her purse more tightly. Elijah's lips parted to speak, but before he could form a word, Kathleen reached forward, too quickly, too forcefully, and snatched the boarding pass from his hand. The paper crinkled in her grip. "Come with me," she barked. Elijah took half a step back. And then it happened. A sharp crack. The sound echoed off the polished cabin walls, silencing the murmurs of pre-flight chatter. Passengers froze. Elijah stood still, his face turned from the blow, a red mark blooming across his cheek like shame rising from the skin. Marla gasped audibly. "You did not just—" she whispered, stepping protectively in front of Elijah. Kathleen stood firm, hands still trembling slightly, as if surprised by her action. "I told you to move," she said, voice cold, void of regret. No one spoke. A business traveler slowly lowered his phone, unsure if he should have been filming. The elderly woman with the book pressed it shut. Elijah reached for his backpack strap, holding it tightly. His knuckles were white, his jaw clenched. But he didn't cry. He just stood, still, unmoving, silent. Marla's voice trembled. "You'll regret that," she said. "You have no idea what you've just done." And from the rear of the cabin, where the last rows of first class met the drawn curtain of business, a tall man stood up. His charcoal gray suit looked unassuming, but his presence stole the breath from the room. He adjusted the cuffs of his jacket slowly, methodically, like a man measuring his words before unsheathing a sword. Every step he took forward brought a deeper hush. Passengers parted, eyes widened. And when he finally reached Kathleen and looked down at her, he spoke just 4 words, quiet, measured, and devastating. "That's my son. That's my son." The words did not thunder, but they struck harder than any shout. Kathleen Brooks stood rooted in place, her eyes slowly lifting to meet the gaze of the man before her. There was no mistaking him now, not just because of the authority in his stance or the deep, unyielding calm in his voice, but because his face was the mirror of Elijah's. Same sharp cheekbones, same poised stillness. The resemblance was undeniable. The cabin seemed to inhale. Nathaniel Monroe did not blink. He stood inches from the woman who had just slapped his child, a child who had said nothing, done nothing, except sit quietly in a seat he had every right to occupy. "Return the boarding pass," he said, his tone as even as it was final. Kathleen's fingers twitched. She slowly, almost mechanically, extended the crumpled paper toward him. Nathaniel didn't take it. Instead, he nodded to Marla, who stepped forward and retrieved the pass with grace that contrasted painfully with the chaos unraveling. "I'd like to speak to your captain," Nathaniel continued. "Immediately. And not from the intercom. Face to face." Kathleen, now pale beneath her carefully applied foundation, opened her mouth then closed it again. She glanced around, perhaps hoping someone, anyone, might step in. But the other flight attendants remained frozen at their posts. The passengers stared, wide-eyed, some with quiet horror, others with a dawning sense of justice long overdue. Marla gently guided Elijah to seat 1A. He sat down without protest, his posture still rigid, his cheeks still glowing from the blow. But his eyes were watching everything, every word, every move. Nathaniel didn't follow his son immediately. He turned toward the aisle where a uniformed crew member stood, young, uncertain. Lily Tran, her name tag read. Her face bore none of Kathleen's hardness, only the kind of stunned empathy that a person can't fake. "You," Nathaniel said to her gently, "please contact the captain. I'll wait here." Lily hesitated, then nodded quickly and vanished behind the curtain toward the cockpit. Kathleen remained standing, unsure of what to do with her hands, her eyes, her shame. Nathaniel turned back toward her. "Ms. Brooks, you are relieved of your duties for the remainder of this flight." She flinched as if slapped herself. "You can wait in the rear galley. You are not to speak to my son or any passenger for the rest of this journey. Do you understand?" Her mouth tightened. "Sir, No," he interrupted softly. "Don't explain. That moment passed the second you raised your hand." The hush in the cabin was no longer one of tension, but of reckoning. A quiet swell of solidarity began to rise, as if the entire aircraft had finally remembered how to breathe. Eyes that had once turned away now turned toward Nathaniel Monroe, not just with curiosity, but with a sense of shared witnessing. Kathleen backed away slowly, her shoes clicking against the floor like footsteps leading into a courtroom. No one stopped her. No one defended her. Even the most indifferent passengers now looked at her with something colder than disapproval, accountability. When she reached the rear of the cabin, Lily returned with the captain in tow. A tall, salt-and-pepper-haired man named Captain Erwin Delgado, who bore the weight of long experience and sudden dread in equal measure. "Mr. Monroe," he said, extending a hand with careful respect, "I was just informed." "I'm not here to debate," Nathaniel said, shaking his hand once before releasing it. "I'm here to inform you that I am invoking Section 4.3 of Internal Corporate Protocol, Executive Intervention." Captain Delgado's eyes widened. That section wasn't public. It wasn't even well known outside the upper executive circle. But Nathaniel Monroe, as the founder and primary stakeholder of Solace Air, didn't need to explain his access to power. "I want a full report logged before we land," he continued. "That includes a statement from every witness, a transcript of the crew's cabin communications, and security footage from the moment boarding began." The captain swallowed hard, nodding. "Yes, sir." "Also," Nathaniel added, his voice a shade darker now, "you'll inform ground control that security will be needed at Gate 24. Not for any passenger disturbance, but for an internal personnel violation. Category A." The captain nodded again, this time with a sense of gravity that went beyond protocol. "I'll handle it personally," he said. Nathaniel inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, then turned and returned to Elijah's side. He sat down, not as a CEO, not as a man of influence, but as a father. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Elijah sat with his eyes on the floor, his breathing steady, though his hands trembled slightly against the armrest. Nathaniel didn't reach out immediately. He knew the kind of boy he'd raised. Elijah didn't need dramatics. He needed the quiet truth. "You didn't deserve that," Nathaniel said calmly. "Not the slap, not the doubt." Elijah nodded faintly. "I didn't even say anything," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "I was just sitting here." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do. And now," he added with a trace of steel in his voice, "so will everyone else." Across the aisle, Marla handed Elijah a small bottle of water. She didn't speak. Her expression said more than any comfort could. Fierce protectiveness, quiet sorrow, and a flicker of righteous fire. In the rear of the plane, Kathleen sat alone on a jump seat, hands folded in her lap, eyes darting, the weight of the moment beginning to press against her spine like gravity made personal. The cabin buzzed only with the hum of engines and the occasional chime of announcements. But beneath that hum, something else had begun. A shift, one that couldn't be undone. And as the plane climbed steadily into cruising altitude, so too did the awareness that this flight was no longer just about destinations. It was now about decisions, about who gets to belong, and who finally stands up when someone is told they don't. Silence can take many forms. There is the kind that settles after turbulence, relieved, fleeting. And then there is the kind that lingers, as if the air itself is holding its breath. That was the silence that filled the first-class cabin of Flight 237. Elijah sat motionless, his fingers curled around the armrest, his cheek still flushed, where the sting of the slap had blossomed hours too early into the morning. He had said little since the confrontation. His voice, already quiet by nature, had now withdrawn deeper into the safety of silence. But his eyes told a different story. They watched everything. Across the aisle, Nathaniel Monroe remained composed. His face was unreadable, carved from years of corporate negotiation and public scrutiny. But to anyone who looked close enough, the fury in his stillness was unmistakable. His every breath was deliberate, controlled. Not because he lacked anger, but because his anger had purpose. Behind them, passengers shifted uneasily in their plush leather seats. A woman in a soft navy blazer twisted the ring on her finger, eyes fixed on the boy across the aisle. She had boarded early, smiled politely at the crew, and taken her glass of champagne without incident. But now she could barely meet Elijah's gaze. Next to her, a man in a charcoal sweater, probably mid-40s, cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly. He looked like he wanted to say something, like the words had been caught in his throat since the slap. But still, he hesitated. No one had spoken up when it happened. Not a single voice had risen when Kathleen struck the boy. And now the weight of that collective silence hung heavy in the filtered cabin air. Marla Jensen, seated to Elijah's right, pulled a small blanket from the overhead and gently draped it over his legs. She didn't speak either. Her silence was different, protective, not uncertain. She reached into her purse and pressed a folded tissue into his hand, her fingers trembling slightly as they touched his. "You okay?" she whispered. Elijah nodded once, but Marla had known him since he was 7. She saw through the nod. Beneath it was something unfamiliar, not just pain, but a kind of quiet rage he didn't yet know how to name. From the galley at the front, Lily Tran returned to the aisle, her face tight but composed. She glanced down the cabin and then stopped next to Nathaniel's seat. "Sir," she said softly, "Captain Delgado has filed the initial report. Ground control has acknowledged the executive intervention protocol. Security will meet us at gate 24. "Good," Nathaniel replied. His voice was level. "And Ms. Brooks?" "In the rear galley. She hasn't spoken." Nathaniel nodded once. "Let's keep it that way." Lily hesitated. "Sir, I was here when it happened. I didn't stop her." There was no defensiveness in her voice, only the kind of shame that seeps in when truth has nowhere else to go. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "You saw. You didn't act," he said plainly. "Now you know better. So the question becomes, what will you do next time?" Lily bowed her head. "Everything I can." He nodded again, then returned his gaze to the window where clouds passed like slow-moving thoughts. Behind them in row 3C, the man in the gray sweater finally stood. He stepped into the aisle and walked carefully to Elijah's seat. The entire cabin noticed. He crouched down so he wouldn't tower over the boy. "Young man," he began, voice low, "I saw everything. I should have said something then. I didn't. And I'm sorry." Elijah looked up. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes seemed to soften just slightly. "I just sat there," the man continued, "because I thought someone else would speak first. I shouldn't have waited." Nathaniel, watching closely now, said nothing. He let the moment speak for itself. Elijah, after a pause, replied quietly, "You weren't the only one." The man nodded slowly, guilt etched into every line of his face. "Thank you for not turning away from this." "I won't either." He stood and returned to his seat. Around him, several passengers began shifting in their chairs, not out of discomfort, but as if trying to rearrange the shape of their silence. One woman dabbed her eyes with a tissue. A young man put down his headphones, no longer pretending to listen to music. A kind of awakening was happening. Slow, uncomfortable, but real. And in the rear galley, Kathleen Brooks could feel it. She sat alone on the jump seat, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her hands, once steady from years of service, now trembled as if they no longer recognized her. The voice of the boy's father echoed in her memory on a loop. "Don't explain. That moment passed the second you raised your hand." She had told herself it was a misunderstanding, that he didn't look the part, that she was just doing her job. But now, seated in silence, stripped of her authority, she realized what she had truly lost wasn't just a job. It was something far more fragile, her self-image. And maybe, just maybe, it had been built on lies she had never questioned. In the front of the plane, Elijah finally leaned back into his seat, his fingers unclenched from the armrest. Marla passed him a small note, folded tightly from her purse. He opened it with care. It read, "They see you now. Let them remember." Outside the cabin, the aircraft soared higher into the sky, but inside something much deeper had begun to descend. Not a fall, but a reckoning. And it was only just beginning. The hum of the aircraft was steady, so steady, in fact, that it seemed almost deliberate, as if the plane itself was trying to neutralize the storm of emotion pulsing through its cabin. But no hum, no ambient calm could drown out the roar of silence in Kathleen Brooks's ears. She sat stiffly on the rear jump seat, staring at the floor, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. Her navy blazer, once a mark of professionalism, now felt like a costume. Her name badge caught the soft overhead light as it dangled, weightless and ironic, a symbol of authority that no longer belonged to her. No one spoke to her, not the crew, not the passengers, not even herself. Because there were no words now, only reckoning. It wasn't just the act, the slap, it was the eyes. Elijah's eyes, wide with disbelief, brimming with quiet dignity, even as his face burned. She had seen it before she struck him, but she hadn't stopped herself. She hadn't even hesitated. Now, all the reasons she'd built her career on, the justifications, the policies, the instincts, sounded hollow. "I didn't think he belonged." The thought echoed with brutal clarity. She hadn't needed a reason, just a feeling, just appearance. And that was the problem. Behind her, two junior crew members whispered by the galley sink. She could hear her name, cut short, swallowed, as if even saying it out loud had become uncomfortable. One of them, a younger woman named Alicia, glanced at her with a look Kathleen couldn't quite decipher, somewhere between pity and contempt. But it was Lily Tran who approached. Lily stood for a moment before speaking, her posture respectful but firm. Her voice, when it came, was gentle, but it had a steel edge that Kathleen had never heard from her before. "I'm going to ask you something," Lily said, "and I want you to answer honestly. Not for me, for yourself." Kathleen said nothing, only raised her eyes, slowly to meet Lily's. "When you saw him," Lily continued, "did you question his seat, or did you question him?" It was a simple question, and yet it cleaved through her like a blade. Kathleen swallowed. Her throat was dry. "I thought," she began. "No," Lily interrupted, her voice low. "Don't think. Just remember, you didn't check his ID. You didn't check the man in khakis who boarded right before him, or the woman in designer sunglasses." Kathleen opened her mouth again, but found no defense. Just air. "You saw him," Lily said, "and you decided." There it was, the sentence no apology could untangle. "I made a mistake," Kathleen whispered. Lily didn't nod, didn't absolve. She simply said, "Not a mistake, a choice." She turned and walked away, leaving Kathleen with that truth. Heavy, final. In the front cabin, meanwhile, the atmosphere had shifted from tense to thoughtful. A few passengers had begun quietly speaking to one another, not about business or weather or their destinations, but about what had just happened. Their words were slow, uncertain, almost reluctant, as though confronting the discomfort meant confronting their silence. Marla remained seated beside Elijah, watching the boy closely. She had known him since his mother died. She had held his hand through piano recitals and therapy sessions and lonely holidays. But this quiet grief was new. She reached for his hand again. He let her. "You've done nothing wrong," she said gently. "Not with your silence, not with your strength." Elijah didn't respond, but the look he gave her was more than gratitude. It was a question he hadn't spoken aloud yet. Will it always be like this? Across the aisle, Nathaniel Monroe stared out the window, his phone resting face down on his lap. He hadn't taken a single call since the incident. He had sent only one message, to the head of the airline's Human Resources Department. The message had read, "Prepare a full transcript, secure footage, begin internal audit, immediate review of crew-wide training standards." A man of few words, but every one of them has a blade. Suddenly, a voice broke through the speaker overhead. The captain. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Delgado. We'll be cruising at 38,000 feet for the next hour. We appreciate your patience today. Upon landing, there will be an extended deplaning process. Please remain seated until instructed." It was a coded message. Every crew member understood. Security would be waiting. At that moment, the woman in the navy blazer, who had watched the entire confrontation unfold without so much as a blink, stood up and approached Nathaniel. "Mr. Monroe," she said softly, "I just wanted to say, I saw everything, and I did nothing. I'm sorry." Nathaniel turned to look at her. "I appreciate your word," he said after a moment, "but silence speaks louder than you think." The woman nodded, visibly shaken. "I know. I won't forget it." And she returned to her tea, smaller than before. For Elijah, it was strange to watch adults crumble around him. He had not asked to be the center of a storm. He had not raised his voice or made a scene. He had simply shown up with a boarding pass and a quiet presence that had, inexplicably, threatened someone. And now that simple act was changing everything. Back in the rear of the plane, Kathleen pulled a small notepad from her blazer pocket. It was a standard crew-issued item, lined, practical, for writing down meal requests or gate changes. But today, she wrote something else. "Today I let pride speak louder than reason." She stared at the sentence for a long time. Then beneath it, she wrote, "I didn't see him, and that was the problem." For the first time in years, Kathleen Brooks felt something she didn't know how to name. Not embarrassment, not regret, grief. Grief for the person she thought she was, and grief for the boy who had taught her, too late, that her rules had always been broken. By the time the cabin lights dimmed to signal early descent, the atmosphere inside Flight 237 had transformed entirely. It was no longer a space of passive luxury, but of watchful stillness, a flying courtroom suspended in the sky, where judgment was not shouted but carried in gazes, in whispered truths, in the weight of what had been left unsaid. Elijah Monroe sat in his seat with his hood gently pulled over his head, not in defiance, but in retreat. His hands rested on the soft blanket Marla had tucked over him. His cheeks still bore the faint flush of the slap, but the real wound had moved deeper, into a place only dignity could reach. Beside him, Marla remained attentive, but silent. She didn't crowd him with questions or affirmations. She simply remained, a steady warmth, a living reminder that Elijah was not alone. Nathaniel across the aisle held his phone to his ear with calm authority. His voice, low and controlled, barely traveled beyond his seat. He wasn't speaking to friends or the press. He was speaking to legal counsel. Yes, before landing. I want every frame of in-cabin footage reviewed. Yes, including body cams from the jet bridge. And I want signed statements from every crew member and available passenger before they disembark. A pause. No, we're not handling this quietly. I want it documented, public, and tied directly to our equity training review. Another pause. No spin, just the truth. He ended the call, lowered the phone, and looked at his son. Elijah, he said gently, would you like to say anything to the captain? Or to her? Elijah didn't answer immediately. His fingers played with the hem of his sleeve, twisting the fabric slowly. I don't want to talk to her, he said after a long moment. His voice was soft, but no longer trembling. I don't want to explain anything to someone who never asked a question. Nathaniel nodded. That's fair. Elijah turned slightly toward the window. The clouds were thinning, revealing a patchwork of city lights beginning to glow below. Do you think people like her ever change? Nathaniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned the question back with rare tenderness. Do you? Elijah thought about it. About the coldness in her voice. About the way her hand had moved. Reflexive, easy. About how she never even looked him in the eye. I don't know, he said quietly. But I hope she has to try. Behind them, passengers had stopped pretending to read or watch movies. Some wrote on notepads. Others held quiet conversations. The energy had shifted from guilt to reflection. In the rear galley, Kathleen Brooks remained seated, her back pressed against the metal panel. The note she had written was still in her hands, folded once, then again. The words on the page stared back at her like an accusation. I didn't see him, and that was the problem. She couldn't stop thinking about it, the way she hadn't even paused. The way she had doubted his presence in first class was as natural as breathing. The way she had acted with the weight of years behind her, years that now felt like a lie. When Lily Tran walked past her with a service tray, Kathleen reached out gently. Lily. Lily paused. I wrote something, Kathleen said. Would you give it to him? Lily looked at the note, then at her. Why don't you? Kathleen's eyes filled. Because I don't want to cause more harm by trying to fix the wrong thing at the wrong time. There was something honest in that. Something broken, yes, but also beginning to rebuild. Lily nodded slowly and took the note. Back in the front of the plane, a soft voice broke the hush. I have a question. Everyone turned. It was Elijah. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't stood, but his words carried through the cabin like wind against still branches. Nathaniel sat upright, startled, but remained silent. The captain, who had just returned to the front to begin pre-landing procedures, turned around slowly. Yes, young man. Elijah took a breath. If I had yelled at her, would that have made this easier for people to understand? Captain Delgado blinked. What do you mean? I mean, Elijah said, if I had shouted or pushed back or made a scene, would that have made it clearer to everyone that I didn't belong in this seat? No one answered. No one could. Elijah's voice didn't rise. Because I just sat here, and still, it was too much. A long silence followed. Then the woman in the navy blazer, the one who had apologized to Nathaniel earlier, spoke from her seat. No, it wouldn't have made it easier, she said quietly, but it would have given people like me an excuse not to care. That truth rippled across the cabin like a current. And then, for the first time since the flight began, Elijah smiled. Not wide, not triumphant, but real. He had found his voice, and the silence had finally learned to listen. Nathaniel exhaled deeply, his shoulders lowering for the first time in hours. He looked across the aisle at his son, the quiet boy who hadn't needed to shout to shake the ground, and he thought, he shouldn't have to be brave to be respected. As the captain returned to the cockpit, Nathaniel opened his phone once more and typed a message to the executive board. I want a full overhaul of crew onboarding, bias training, and disciplinary protocol. Every flight, every route. The policy will bear his name. A pause, then he added, start drafting it, now. As Flight 237 began its descent, the cabin lights brightened slightly, and the soft chime of the seatbelt sign broke through the charged quiet. Passengers stirred, not with the usual impatience to disembark, but with the measured restraint of people who knew they were part of something bigger than themselves. The voice of Captain Delgado came over the intercom, calm but unmistakably weighted. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly at Gate 24. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened. And thank you for your cooperation today. He didn't mention security. He didn't need to. The entire cabin already knew. In seat 1A, Elijah sat upright, his hands folded in his lap. He had removed his hoodie, revealing the quiet dignity of his posture. Marla placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and whispered, almost there. Elijah nodded, but his eyes were fixed ahead, not out of fear, but out of resolve. Across the aisle, Nathaniel Monroe had already shut off his phone. The final messages had been sent. The review had been ordered. Legal was standing by, and outside the gate, a black car with dark-tinted windows waited, exactly as he'd arranged, out of the press's view, but close enough to make a statement if needed. He looked at his son and said softly, remember, you don't owe anyone a reaction. Elijah didn't speak, but his nod was firmer now. He understood. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about clarity and truth. Behind them, passengers fumbled for their things with an unusual hesitance. No one rushed to the aisle. No one joked about luggage or connections. Conversations were hushed, reverent, as if they'd all walked through something sacred and searing. Near the rear galley, Kathleen Brooks sat like a shadow of herself. Her posture was small now, her hands wringing the edges of the notepad she had filled with quiet, scribbled regret. Her Navy uniform, once pressed and proud, now looked creased and out of place. The note she had asked Lily to deliver still hadn't been returned. She didn't know if Elijah had read it. She didn't know if it mattered anymore. She only knew that the cabin she once commanded had turned into a courtroom, and she was no longer the enforcer. She was the accused. The plane touched down with a gentle, controlled bump. No applause, no sign of relief. Only the sound of brakes slows justice in motion. As they taxied to the gate, Elijah glanced out the window. A row of vehicles had lined up outside. 2 black SUVs, a private sedan, and a silver airport security vehicle. A man in a dark blazer stood near the jet bridge holding a clipboard, his earpiece catching the sunlight. Elijah's heart beat faster, not from fear, from weight, from knowing what this moment meant. Are they here for her? He asked softly. Nathaniel didn't look away from the window. They're here for the truth, he said. What happens after that is up to her. The cabin door opened with a hiss. A senior gate supervisor stepped into the entryway, flanked by 2 uniformed airport security officers. Their presence was silent, firm, and unmistakable. Kathleen saw them before they spoke. Her breath caught. She didn't rise. The gate supervisor, a composed woman with a clipboard and a badge that read, Monica Griggs, Operations, approached Lily at the galley. Where is Ms. Brooks? Lily didn't point. She simply stepped aside. Kathleen stood slowly, placing her notepad on the counter like an offering. She walked toward them with measured steps, her eyes low, her badge glinting in one last betrayal of who she had once thought herself to be. Ms. Brooks, Monica said professionally, you are being escorted off the flight per executive directive. You'll remain in the care of our internal team pending formal review and statement collection. Kathleen nodded. Her voice cracked. Understood. Passengers watched as she walked down the aisle. Not briskly, not defiantly, but with the quiet gait of someone carrying her verdict. No one clapped. No one smirked. Even those who had once turned away could no longer pretend not to see. As she passed Elijah's row, she slowed, just for a moment. He didn't look at her, but he knew. And so did she. The security officers followed her out, a silent procession of consequence. Nathaniel waited until she was gone before standing. He turned to the remaining crew members, still frozen near the galley. "I'll expect your written statements by close of day," he said calmly. "Every one of you." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He didn't need to. His presence alone carried the full weight of institutional reform. Across the aisle, a woman who had been silent for most of the flight leaned forward and said to Marla, "Your boy, he stayed strong. Not many could do that." Marla offered a soft smile. "He shouldn't have had to." Elijah stood in the aisle, backpack over his shoulder. He didn't rush, didn't hide. As he stepped off the plane, cameras did wait, not visible to most, but Nathaniel had seen the flashes from behind the tinted glass. He gently placed a hand on Elijah's back. "We walk," he said. Elijah nodded. They walked across the jet bridge together, father, son, and guardian, beneath fluorescent lights and heavy eyes. Behind them, silence lingered in the aircraft like smoke after fire. And somewhere near Gate 24, the first internal memo had already been drafted. Effective immediately, all flight crew will undergo reevaluation under the Equity and Dignity Protocol, a new mandatory framework approved by executive order under the name Elijah Monroe Reform. By the time Elijah, Nathaniel, and Marla exited through the private corridor at Gate 24, the air outside the terminal had changed. It wasn't just the bustle of arriving passengers or the idle murmurs of ground crew. It was electricity, a growing static charge of attention, of consequence. The black SUV was waiting at the curb, tinted windows hiding the chaos that had begun to swell on the sidewalk just beyond the roped-off press line. A cluster of reporters, local first, but already joined by a national outlet or two, stood behind stanchions, cell phones raised, microphones extended, shouting the name Nathaniel Monroe, as if calling down thunder. But Elijah didn't look at them. His gaze was on the pavement beneath his shoes, still quiet, still centered. But his posture had shifted. He stood straighter now, not in defiance but in ownership. This was his story, and he was no longer letting it be written without him. Marla opened the car door as Nathaniel shielded Elijah from the flashes. Inside, the vehicle offered a momentary return to silence. The doors closed with a muted click, shutting out the shouts, the sirens, the chaos. Elijah sank into the seat, pulling the strap of his backpack close. He didn't cry, didn't speak. He simply stared out the window. And then, without turning, he said softly, "They're going to make it about the company, aren't they?" Nathaniel, seated beside him, didn't answer right away. He watched his son carefully, measuring his words. "They'll try," he finally said, "but we won't let them." Outside, the car pulled away, leaving behind the flashbulbs and false narratives. Ahead of them, something bigger was taking shape. 2 hours later, in a sleek corner office on the 31st floor of Solace Air headquarters, a high-stakes meeting had been hastily assembled. The executive board sat in a half circle around the glass table, their faces pale, their fingers tight around pens and coffee cups. A large monitor on the wall played a muted news clip, footage already leaked of Kathleen Brooks being escorted off the flight, followed by a slow zoom on Elijah's face as he stepped from the plane. The caption below read, "Flight attendant assaults teen in first class. CEO's son speaks out in silence." In the center of the room stood Nathaniel Monroe, not seated, not observing, commanding. His tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled once, but his voice was sharp, measured. "I've reviewed the footage, I've read the cabin log, I've spoken with every involved staff member except Kathleen Brooks, who will have her opportunity to respond during her disciplinary hearing." He paused, scanning the room. "This is no longer about a single slap. This is about every unchecked bias that sits just beneath the surface of our uniformed professionalism. And we've allowed it. Through omission, through design, through convenience. One of the executives, a silver-haired man named Rothman, cleared his throat. Nathaniel, if I may, our public relations team is drafting a formal statement of apology and empathy. We intend to lead with, no, Nathaniel said flatly. No drafted sympathy, no diluted messaging. We lead with accountability, and then we build the system that should have existed in the first place. Rothman hesitated. You mean, what, exactly? Nathaniel tapped the folder in front of him. I'm introducing the EM protocol. It's named after my son, but it won't be about him. He opened the folder. It will mandate retraining for every crew member, but not just on procedure, on perception. Every first-class attendant will undergo quarterly behavioral audits, implicit bias analysis, and supervised evaluations. He stepped closer to the board table. Anonymous passenger reporting will be piloted immediately. Any guest who feels dismissed, disrespected, or profiled will have a real-time channel to be heard without fear. Another executive raised a hand. And funding? Nathaniel didn't hesitate. We reallocate executive bonuses and trim 10% from non-critical marketing for the next 2 quarters. Silence. He let it settle. Let me be clear, he continued. This isn't a press cycle. This isn't a gesture. This is the start of a new architecture. If we're going to keep branding ourselves as a modern airline, then we begin with the modern passenger experience, which includes respect, dignity, and equity. Someone exhaled audibly. The tension cracked like ice. The board wasn't resisting, not because they agreed yet, but because they knew better than to challenge a man who had just transformed a scandal into a mandate for justice before the rest of the industry even reacted. Later that evening, in the quiet of their family home, Elijah sat on the back porch steps with a steaming mug of cocoa in hand. The night air was cool, laced with the smell of pine and distant rain. Lights from the kitchen spilled onto the wooden deck behind him, where Marla moved quietly inside. Nathaniel stepped out with a soft creak of the door. He didn't speak at first, just sat beside Elijah. The boy sipped his cocoa, then asked without looking over, "Do you think they'll listen?" Nathaniel thought a moment. Not all of them. Not right away, he admitted, but some will, and the ones who don't, won't last. A long pause followed. Then Elijah said, I didn't want to be the face of something. You're not, Nathaniel said. You're the spark. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded paper. Lily had passed it to him during a brief call earlier. It was the note Kathleen had written. Elijah took it cautiously, unfolding it. It read, I didn't see you, and that was the problem. I thought I was fair, but I was blind. I judged. I failed. I'm sorry. Elijah read the words once, then again. He didn't speak, but after a moment, he folded it carefully and slipped it into the back pocket of his jeans. It didn't fix anything, but it meant something. From the porch, he looked out into the quiet stretch of trees beyond the yard. The world felt heavier now, but it also felt sharper, clearer. He wasn't just surviving the moment anymore. He was reshaping it. The invitation arrived 3 days after Flight 237 touched down. It wasn't delivered by a courier or wrapped in embossed stationery. It came through a simple email, subject line clear and understated. Student Forum, Equity and Voice. We'd like you to speak. The sender was Mr. Hadley, a history teacher at Elijah's high school and longtime moderator of the school's Equity and Justice panel. The message was brief, but the final sentence carried weight. Your voice matters even if it wasn't asked for before. Now we're asking. Elijah stared at the screen for a long time. He didn't click reply. He didn't delete it either. He simply sat with it. That evening at dinner, the topic came up. Nathaniel had just returned from a closed-door board session. The EM protocol had been approved unanimously. By the end of the quarter, it would become mandatory policy for all crew across all Solace Air flights. It was the first time in the company's history that reform had been enacted in less than 7 days. But tonight, Nathaniel didn't talk about policy. He talked about legacy. They've never seen someone stay that calm, that centered, he said, glancing at Elijah across the table. You didn't have to yell to be heard, and that made the silence around you louder than ever. Elijah pushed his food around on the plate, still undecided. I got invited to speak, he said eventually. At school, Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. And? I don't know if I want to be that person, Elijah admitted. I didn't ask to be the face of a problem. I just wanted to get home. Marla from the other end of the table said gently, and yet, you never backed down. Elijah looked up. I didn't stand up either. Nathaniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. You didn't have to. The world stood up because you sat still. That night, Elijah drafted a reply to Mr. Hadley. He hasn't sent it yet, but he wrote one word in the body of the message. Yes. The forum took place in the school auditorium the following week. It wasn't packed with media or lined with camera crews. There were no bright lights or broadcast anchors, just rows of folding chairs, the smell of auditorium paint, and the hum of students who had suddenly grown a little more aware of the world around them. On stage sat 6 students from different grades and backgrounds. The final seat was left empty until Elijah arrived. He wore a navy sweater, not to blend in, but to remind himself that he never needed to change his appearance to be worthy of space. Mr. Hadley introduced the panel with calm enthusiasm. No one on this stage is a hero. They're not here because they fought their way onto the news, he said. They're here because they showed courage most difficultly by simply being honest in a world that often isn't. When it was Elijah's turn to speak, the room quieted. He didn't clear his throat, didn't fidget. He simply leaned toward the mic and said, I didn't ask for anyone's permission to sit where I was supposed to sit, but someone decided I didn't belong. Not because of what I did, but because of what they assumed I was. And the worst part, he continued, it wasn't the slap. It wasn't even the embarrassment. It was how quiet everything got after. How long did it take someone to say, this is wrong? A ripple of stillness moved through the crowd. I don't want applause. I don't want a hashtag. I want the next person who gets judged for how they look to be met with a voice that shows up sooner. Because I didn't yell, and I still got heard. That means all of us, quiet, loud, nervous, brave, have power if we choose to use it. He paused, then ended simply. Silence is not strength. Knowing when to speak and when to stand beside someone else's truth. That's strength. There was no standing ovation, just stillness. And in that stillness, a kind of awakening, one that didn't need applause to be remembered. The next morning, as Elijah walked through the school's main hallway, students who had never looked his way before now offered quiet nods. Not the hollow kind of admiration that came from notoriety, but the sincere, almost reverent kind that said, we heard you, and we're listening now. Later, as he sat under a tree near the science building, a younger student named Marcus approached hesitantly. Hey, he said, fidgeting with his backpack strap. I saw the video, not just the one from school. The plane is one too. Elijah didn't look up. Yeah? Marcus nodded. People used to tell me I didn't belong in the honors program. I started to believe it until I saw what you said. Elijah finally looked at him. You didn't yell, you didn't fight, but you didn't move either. That helped. There was no follow-up, no praise. Just truth passed from one student to another, as quietly as the injustice that had once tried to define them. Meanwhile, at Solace Air headquarters, Nathaniel sat at his desk reviewing the early drafts of the EM Protocol Handbook. In bold lettering on the cover, just below the company logo, were 5 words, see the passenger, not assumption. Beside it was a new internal policy notice. Effective immediately. All new hire orientation must include a live case study on Flight 237 and testimony from passengers and affected individuals. Nathaniel read the line twice, then made a note in the margin. Include audio of Elijah's forum speech, if he agrees. He paused, then wrote one more note beneath it. Request his permission personally, not as a CEO, as a father. It started with a clip, 37 seconds long. No narration, no dramatic music. Just a boy in a navy sweater, speaking at a school auditorium, his voice steady and unembellished. Silence is not strength. Knowing when to speak and when to stand beside someone else's truth, that's strength. By the end of the day, it had over 12 million views. Elijah Monroe hadn't meant to go viral. He hadn't crafted a speech to stir hearts. He had simply told the truth, and the world was finally ready to hear it. Major news networks picked it up first, then influencers, then late-night hosts. The clip aired between coverage of airline stocks and congressional hearings. Hashtags formed like wildfire. Shaksh's Seat 1A, the Elijah Monroe Protocol, Shakti your dignity is seat. By day 3, 2 other major airlines announced emergency internal reviews of their crew conduct policies. By day 5, a senator from California issued a public statement. If a child must suffer public humiliation before we address equity in air travel, then we've already failed. Meanwhile, at Solace Air headquarters, the EM protocol moved from initiative to institution. New crew orientation manuals were updated. In-flight reporting systems were quietly tested. And Nathaniel Monroe, usually a man behind the curtain, appeared on a primetime special with a single statement. We are not fixing something broken. We are acknowledging that we never built it right to begin with. But for Elijah, none of this felt like triumph, because the thing he remembered most was not the applause or the trending hashtags or even the reform documents that now bore his name. He remembered the sound of her hand breaking the stillness of that first-class cabin, and she had yet to answer for it. It was a Wednesday afternoon when the disciplinary hearing was held. Internal Affairs Conference Room C, Solace Air HQ, Level 19. Kathleen Brooks arrived 10 minutes early. She wore a gray cardigan instead of her uniform. Her posture was stiff, her hair pulled back with mechanical neatness. The notepad in her hands, creased, overused, was filled with scribbled reflections she had read and rewritten every night since the flight. Across the room sat 3 officials, one from HR, one from legal, and one from the newly formed Passenger Equity Council. Also present was Nathaniel Monroe. He didn't sit at the table. He sat behind it as a silent observer. This wasn't about revenge. It was about closure. Ms. Brooks, the HR lead began, you are here today to respond to allegations of professional misconduct and physical assault during Flight 237. Do you understand the charges? Kathleen nodded. Yes. You have prepared a statement? I have. The room fell silent as she stood. Her voice trembled at first, then settled. I used to believe I was fair. T followed the rules, remained neutral, and treated all passengers the same. But I've come to realize neutrality is not fairness when your instincts are corrupted by bias. On that flight, I judged a boy by how he looked. I questioned his presence, not his paperwork. I made assumptions. Then I made it worse. She paused, glancing briefly, nervously, at Nathaniel, then back at the panel. When I struck him, I didn't just violate protocol. I broke something in myself, and I understand that no apology can undo the harm. She placed her notepad on the table. I accept whatever decision you make, but if there is one thing I ask, it's that the policies you build next come not from punishment, but from prevention. The legal counsel nodded once. Thank you, Ms. Brooks. You may be seated. Nathaniel remained still, but something in his gaze shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps recognition. That in her shame, she had at last begun to face the truth. The council convened briefly in private. Upon return, the verdict was delivered. Kathleen Brooks would be terminated effective immediately. She would be barred from working in any in-flight supervisory capacity within Solace Air or its partners. A formal letter of accountability would be published in the internal crew journal, attached with her consent. There were no outbursts, no protests, only her quiet nod. Then the chair turned to Nathaniel. Would you like to make a closing statement? He stood slowly, looked across the room. No, then paused. But I would like to speak with her, alone. The others looked at one another, then quietly left the room. Kathleen didn't move. Nathaniel stepped forward, just close enough. She thought you were going to yell, Kathleen said softly. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. Elijah, she clarified. I thought he was going to raise his voice. Nathaniel studied her. And he didn't. No, he just stayed. Nathaniel nodded. That's how change begins, he said quietly, with someone who doesn't move, and someone else who finally has to. Kathleen swallowed hard. I saw your son, but not as a person. I saw what I expected. Nathaniel didn't reply immediately. Then, now you've seen more. He turned and left. That night, Elijah sat in his room scrolling through emails. One stood out. It was from the airline's training division. We are developing a series of real-world case studies for new crew members. Your story will be the first. We would be honored if you consider lending your voice. He didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, he turned to his notebook, the one Marla had bought him before the school year started. In the back, he wrote a sentence. She thought I'd yell. I didn't, and that scared her more. He looked at it for a long time, then flipped the page, and began writing what might one day become the first chapter of something bigger. The ceremony wasn't grand. There were no red carpets, no choreographed standing ovations, no flashing lights or blaring anthems. It took place in a sunlit hall at JFK International Airport, in a wing newly renovated by Solace Air as part of its systemic reform initiative. The walls were white, the glasses clean, the stage simple. And on that stage stood a new symbol, a first-class seat restored from the very aircraft where the incident had occurred. Its seatbelt was replaced, the armrest is polished, and on the headrest, stitched in silver thread, were 4 quiet words: reserved for dignity first. The seat wasn't for sale. It wasn't for status. It was there to remind every crew member who walked through the terminal for a new rotation and every traveler passing by. Dignity doesn't come with a boarding pass. It comes with humanity. Elijah Monroe didn't want to attend the ceremony at first. When the invitation came, an official letter from Solace Air's Reform Council, now co-chaired by both internal leaders and external passenger advocates, he tucked it into a drawer for 3 days. It feels like they're trying to turn me into something, he told Nathaniel, who sat across from him at the kitchen table. They're not, his father replied. You already are something. Elijah stared at the folded letter. I'm not a symbol, Nathaniel nodded. Good, because symbols fade, but stories stay. Eventually, Elijah agreed, not to be celebrated, but to be present. On the day of the ceremony, the hall filled slowly. Crew members arrived in uniform, some of them new hires, some veterans. Beside them were educators, youth leaders, students, airline executives, and quietly, near the back, a woman in a slate gray coat. Her hands were folded, her expression unreadable. It was Kathleen Brooks. She didn't speak, didn't ask for acknowledgement. She simply stood and watched. As the program began, a soft voice rang out over the room. It was Marla. She took the podium not as an employee or advocate, but as someone who had stood next to Elijah on the worst day of his life. I've walked beside this young man through fear, confusion, and silence, she said. And what I've learned is that real courage isn't loud. It doesn't need headlines. It doesn't come from speeches. It comes from choosing to stay still when the world tells you to move. A murmur of emotion swept through the room. Then Mr. Hadley, Elijah's teacher, read from the school forum testimony, his voice cracking slightly on the final words. We must speak our truth, not just for ourselves, but for every kid told they don't belong. Finally, Nathaniel Monroe approached the stage. He didn't speak long. He simply placed a hand on the restored seat and said, This isn't about our name. It's about what we refuse to ignore ever again. And then he turned to the audience. Elijah, he called softly, would you like to say something? All eyes turned. Elijah stood near the side of the stage, dressed not in a suit, but in a simple sweater and jeans. He didn't walk like a speaker. He walked like a passenger. He approached the mic, paused, and looked out at the crowd. Then he said, I'm not here because I was strong. I'm here because I was seen. I was just sitting in a seat my dad paid for. I followed every rule, and I still got treated like a problem. But here's what changed everything. Someone finally looked again. He glanced at the crew members in the front row. So if you ever doubt what you see, look again, not to challenge, but to understand. Because I'm not special. I'm just someone who deserved better. We all do. He stepped back, and the room, still quiet, stood up, not to applaud, to witness. That evening, as Elijah and his father walked through the terminal on their way home, they passed the new training wing Solace Air had opened near Concourse D. A glass wall revealed a classroom inside, where uniformed trainees sat, notebooks open, as a facilitator stood beside a projection of Flight 237's seating chart. At the front of the room was a plaque. It read, The Elijah Monroe Protocol. a foundation of dignity in flight. Beside it, a screen looped his school forum clip, muted but subtitled, reminding every future employee that policies were built from the pain of those once overlooked. Elijah stood at the glass for a long moment. "They're learning," Nathaniel said. "Finally," Elijah replied. Then he asked, "Do you think it'll last?" Nathaniel paused. "That depends," he said. "Will you keep telling your story?" Elijah nodded. "Then yes, it will." And miles away in a quiet apartment lined with old uniforms and unopened letters, Kathleen Brooks sat at her kitchen table. She had watched the ceremony online. She had stood silently in the back of the room. And now she sat with a pen in hand, drafting a letter, not for forgiveness, but for something more difficult, a letter of endorsement. She would be submitting herself for voluntary training, not to regain a job, but to offer her voice to the reform panel, to speak honestly about failure, not to cleanse her name, but to carry the weight of it, because she had finally learned what Elijah had known all along. Respect isn't given because of a badge. It's earned by the way you choose to see. As night fell, Elijah sat by his window, watching airplanes blink across the sky like stars in motion. Somewhere out there, another kid was boarding another flight. Maybe they looked like him. Maybe they'd feel out of place. Maybe, because of all this, they wouldn't. He smiled, folded the silver-stitched boarding pass that had once held more power than it should have, and placed it in a small box labeled "Keep Going." Because for him, the seat wasn't just reclaimed. It had been rewritten, not just for himself, but for every child told they didn't belong before they even spoke. Morale of the story. This story reminds us that true dignity doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. Elijah Monroe didn't raise his voice or cause a scene. He simply stayed in his seat, calm and resolute, while the world around him was forced to confront its own biases. It teaches us that prejudice doesn't always arrive with hatred. It often hides behind assumptions, silence, and uniforms of authority. But when someone dares to remain still in the face of injustice, that stillness becomes a mirror, revealing what many would rather not see. Elijah's quiet courage sparked a movement, not because he demanded attention, but because he refused to disappear. From Kathleen's fall to Nathaniel's leadership, from corporate reckoning to policy reform, we learn that accountability is not about revenge. It's about rebuilding trust, one action at a time. And most of all, we learn that belonging should never be something you have to prove.